Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Anchor Watch. And it's always special when we get the attorney extraordinaire, Liz Oyer, on. And originally, we were going to do a story, a show about the 4th of July and heroes. But with all the stuff the Supreme Court just dumped right before they went out of session, Liz, first of all, the fact that you're coming on, thank you, because I know your time is very valuable right now. But more importantly, I have so many questions for you. First of all, how are you doing?
I am overwhelmed. I think like a lot of people, just trying to take it day by day and minute by minute, figuring out where our country is headed. How about you?
Okay, cool. I'm not a lawyer and never stepped foot in a law school. I was a poli-sci major at Annapolis, but this is beyond the pale as far as everything that's happening. So if you don't mind, let's start with some of the decisions. Just get your initial reaction. You don't have to be well baked and argued out, but just what your initial thoughts are. First, let's talk about the birthright citizenship ruling, which to me, as a layman, an average American citizen, I thought would be a no-brainer 9-0 decision.
Right. Yeah.
But instead, it's not. Can you please explain what this was about and what the decision tells the American people?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Bobby. This is a no-brainer. The Constitution says that if you're born in this country, you're a citizen of this country. And that has been challenged by Donald Trump because he doesn't like the fact that people get citizenship automatically. He would prefer to be able to reserve citizenship for people he believes are deserving. And that's not what the Constitution says. So it should be very clear. We've got all these conservative justices who consider themselves what is called originalists. So they want the Constitution to retain its original meaning and the originalist version of it after the 14th Amendment was passed is that if you're born here, you are a citizen automatically. So that should be a no-brainer, but it wasn't. There are a number of conservative justices on the court who believe that they can reinterpret the Constitution to mean that if you're the child of an immigrant who's born here, you're not automatically a citizen. This is obviously motivated by partisan political ideology and not by a faithful interpretation of the Constitution, which is really concerning because the Supreme Court, at least in theory, is supposed to be above the fray of politics. It is clear right now that it is not, and that political ideology is influencing the decisions that they're making. Fortunately, we just barely had a majority of justices who did not want to interpret the Constitution in a way that is totally inconsistent with what it actually says. But it's really pretty shocking that it's not a 9-0 decision.
Right. Was it Alito who basically talked about jurisdiction with this or intent? I don't know how one says my intent was not to be born a citizen or was to be born a citizen. It was unbelievable. I stopped reading his opinion because I was like, wait, what? I had to suspend my willing suspicion of disbelief, I guess. But this seemed to be a theme throughout these rulings that were handed down. So we go from birthright citizenship to mail-in ballots, you know, the validity there. I think your original premise is right. There's a political overtone to these decisions. Can you explain what happened with that case and why does it matter?
Yeah, so this is another example of it should have been a no-brainer. It should have been a 9-0 decision. I believe this one was 5-4, or maybe it was 6-3.
Yep, 5-4.
Okay, so this is a decision about whether the state of Alabama can count ballots 5 days after election day, mail-in ballots. Can they continue to count those ballots under state law for 5 days? And that's what the state law says. You've got 5 days from the date of election day to continue counting ballots as long as the ballot has been cast and postmarked by the day of the election. Federal law requires that elections happen on a certain day, but federal law does not require that you get all of the ballots from mail-ins returned on election day. And the Constitution specifically says that it is up to states to make their own laws where there's no governing federal law about how to conduct their elections. States have different rules and regulations about mail-in ballots. Mostly people like mail-in ballots because it makes it easier to vote. It makes it easier to exercise your right under the Constitution to cast a vote and make your voice heard in our democracy. So mail-in ballots have become widely accepted as valid. Donald Trump doesn't like mail-in ballots, and some conservative members of the Supreme Court apparently don't either. And this decision just, barely held that the states have the right to make their own laws. And it upheld this law that allows ballots to be counted after the election. There are people who will tell you that from a policy perspective, it's not good policy if we don't have the results of the election on election day. And that's a legitimate argument to make. But what's not legitimate is to say that when the state has a law in place, you can just change it at the last minute and really interfere with people's ability to vote. The Constitution says that states can make these laws, and they did so here. And that law, fortunately, was upheld by the Supreme Court. There could be a law of Congress that changes this in the future. Congress could say states are no longer allowed to count mail-in ballots after Election Day. That's something that Congress would probably have the power to do under the Constitution. But right now, that's not the law, and the Supreme Court upheld the state law because there's no congressional law that says differently.
Can you clarify something? Because I have a couple of follow-ups on this. Again, I studied political science. It was my understanding with the Constitution, my interpretation, that federal law, the federal level of government, is not supposed to run elections. That is supposed to be a state's rights, that term, a state's right issue as far as how they run their election. Is it me? Am I crazy? Or is Donald Trump in his current administration trying to reach in and influence basically elections that should be held at the state level as far as how they're ran? Is that a bridge too far? Am I wrong or exaggerating? Because that seems to be the thing happening here.
He absolutely is trying to do that. So you're absolutely right that the states primarily have the authority under the Constitution to make rules related to elections. There are some limited federal laws as well, and the federal government can make some laws with respect to elections, including, like I mentioned, setting a national election day for the general election. But as far as state elections are concerned, they're up to the states to decide how to conduct them. And when the president suddenly says you can't do this or you can do that, it creates some real problems because states have local jurisdictions throughout them that are responsible for administering elections, even in the most remote places. It's not like a centralized, like a state has one election office. So if you've got the president saying, we're going to require XYZ changes on election day, like we're going to require voter ID or this or that, the other thing, that is something that would require a whole lot of lead time for a state to be able to implement it, to make sure that it doesn't disenfranchise everybody, to make sure that election workers in all areas of the state are able to be trained in what the rules are so that they can administer elections according to law on election day. Like the fact that we're talking about changes to elections now with midterms coming up in a few months in November, it's really, we shouldn't even be talking about it. There is no time to have states redo their election procedures. Donald Trump is still advocating for this legislation called the SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship to vote. If we were to implement that now, even if it were legal to do that, it would be a disaster to try to get that implemented in an orderly fashion and make sure that our elections are free and fair in November. And that's exactly the point. Donald Trump is trying to make changes that will sow chaos into the election so that if the results are not something that he likes, he will have some basis to say that the elections were rigged and they weren't fair, and he'll be challenging the results if they don't go his way.
I think you nailed it. One of the things that's really bothering me specifically about this case is you have a lot of military members, active duty, who vote mail-in ballot. And they, given what's happening with Iran and areas of the world where specifically the mail service via Pete Hegseth has been shut down, you're now telling me that those people who used to be me will not be able to participate in their election. That is mind-blowing. That's not America first. That's literally the ones that you put in harm's way suffering the consequences of this action. It's mind-blowing. So staying in the political realm with Supreme Court decisions, this ruling of basically allowing people to donate as much money as they want, I need help understanding this, because if it's what I think it is, I think it was what the Republican National Committee versus was it Watson versus the Republican, where they're passing this law saying, hey, No, I'm sorry. That's the wrong one. The case where you basically can donate as much money as you want as an individual, a la Citizens United, where a corporation can donate as much money as you want. The coordination of super PACs alongside actual political candidates, they're saying that's now legal. That's a much better way to describe it. I'm very, very, very scared about what this is going to do with elections moving forward. Can you please put it in a much more eloquent way of what just happened?
Well, so Bobby, campaign finance law is not my area of expertise. It's really complicated niche area of law, but I've started to realize that it's, what's complicated about it is actually just that it doesn't make any sense, that the decisions are incredibly counterintuitive. And that's why I think it seems like I hear about it and I'm like, oh, that sounds very technical. And I don't really understand what's going on, but I took a look at this one and you know what? I figured out what's actually going on is just that people are being allowed to pour so much money into elections without any limit that it makes no logical or rational sense, but that's just what the Supreme Court has decided. And it all really relates back to the Supreme Court says it relates back to the First Amendment. They're saying that there's a free speech right and that money is speech. Essentially, you have the right under the First Amendment to spend money to get people elected into office. And it began with individual people can spend as much as they want. And then it extended into corporations can spend as much as they want because corporations have free speech rights too, which is like, what? And now it's political parties and these national coordinating committees also have the right to spend as much as they want on elections. So essentially, the Supreme Court has invented this fictional doctrine that organizations and corporations have free speech rights just like you and I do, and that money is speech. So the richest of the rich are the ones who have the most influence over elections, thanks to this incredibly convoluted view of what the First Amendment is all about. I mean, I sort of think that it doesn't make any sense because it really doesn't make any sense. I mean, it just doesn't.
Right.
Like that's crazy. And that is really, I think, at the root of so many of our problems politically is that corporations and now political parties have such outsized influence and individual people do not have the same ability to influence elections as corporate interests do. And that affects the policies that are made. It affects who is able to be elected to represent us and who they're beholden to once they get to Washington, D.C. It is just a tremendous problem. And it's unfortunately not so easy to fix because the Supreme Court has tied it to the Constitution. And it would probably at this point take a constitutional amendment to restore some sanity to our elections and get the money influence out of our politics.
Well, that's very disheartening, but that's kind of how I read it too. But let me pivot to something that I know you know something about. Todd Blanche, he's going up for the permanent seat of Attorney General of the United States. Me personally, everything I've read about this, everything I've read about him, all of his interviews that I've watched, why is this even an option? I feel like it's a conflict of interest. I feel like it's in bad faith. I feel like the Attorney General, the office, if he's confirmed, becomes basically Donald Trump's personal law firm with the ability and the authority to execute using federal resources on his behalf. Am I wrong in that thought process?
No, I mean, that's essentially what's happening now. And the reason why it's so distressing to think that the Senate might confirm Todd Blanche is because they already confirmed him once. They confirmed him to be Deputy Attorney General, and he proved exactly how bad he was going to be in that role over the last year or so. And if we confirm him again, based on his track record to date, that really just shows that our democracy is not functioning and that the Senate is not doing their job of vetting candidates and making decisions based on judgment about who is suited for the role. Todd Blanche has shown time and time after again as Deputy Attorney General and now as Acting Attorney General that his client is Donald Trump. His first and always loyalty is to Donald Trump over and above the American people. And that is, as you said, a fundamental conflict of interest. He has not been able to set aside that conflict of interest and prioritize the interests of the American people. And that makes him fundamentally unsuited to the role of Attorney General. There are just so many examples of him betraying the interests of the American people because he is placing Donald Trump's personal or political interests ahead of them, that it really would be an absolute disgrace if the Senate were to confirm him, which is not to say that they won't do that.
So, yeah, so please explain this to me. Todd Blanche, I feel like it's a conflict of interest. Can you please explain to me and our viewers why you think that is the case? Because I honestly don't understand how this man, who is the private personal lawyer of President Trump, is really up for legitimate confirmation by the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, so there's a number of examples that illustrate the conflict of interest and how problematic it is. And one of them is the situation with Ghislaine Maxwell. So Donald Trump essentially deployed Todd Blanche as his fixer to help him solve the political crisis that the Jeffrey Epstein case has created for him. And Todd Blanche did that essentially by selling out the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and the American people. He orchestrated last summer this trip to visit Ghislaine Maxwell in prison in Florida and got her to say on the record nice things about Donald Trump, including that she never saw Trump do anything improper with Jeffrey Epstein. And that was solicited from her, it looks like, in exchange for transferring her to a minimum security prison, to a prison where she would not be eligible to serve her sentence under longstanding Justice Department policies. But Todd Blanche, as the number 2 official at the time in the Justice Department, pulled some strings, got her transferred to this nicer prison. She gave him the exonerating statements about Donald Trump. It was a win-win for everybody except the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and the American people. So that's just one example of Blanche placing Trump's interests over and above everyone else's. Another really glaring one is this settlement agreement that was entered into. Donald Trump sued for $10 billion over the leak of his tax returns. As Deputy Attorney General and now Acting Attorney General, Blanche has a fiduciary duty to us, the American people, to protect our tax dollars from frivolous lawsuits. Trump's lawsuit was utterly frivolous. It was about to get thrown out of court. And seeing that that's what was about to happen, Blanche decided to enter into a settlement agreement with Donald Trump to make sure that he walked away with what he was after. So the settlement had 2 components. One was the slush fund, which I know everybody listening has heard about. And that part of it is totally corrupt for obvious reasons. But the part of it that's even more problematic from my perspective as a lawyer is this release of claims. There was a separate part of the settlement agreement where Todd Blanche signed away the rights of the United States to audit, investigate, or sue Donald Trump in any civil matter by any federal agency, which people have interpreted to mean that we're not going to be able to audit him anymore for tax issues, but it actually has broader implications than that. It means that we really can't do any type of investigation of Trump or his business interests or his family members. We can't make any efforts to collect the money, to recoup the money that he has looted from our government through grift. And that applies into perpetuity for all of time. Blanche has waved away the rights of America to seek any type of legal recourse against Donald Trump. That is just an epic betrayal of the American people. And the only way that that can be explained is that he put Donald Trump's personal financial interests over and above the interests of the American people, which in my mind is all it takes to show he's unfit to be Attorney General.
So let me make sure I understand this. You're telling me the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America gave a golden ticket to a man, being completely, full transparency, a 30-plus time convicted felon of future prosecution when dealing with tax laws and all that, to him and his family. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, everybody in the Trump family, everybody in that whole orbit is off the hook. All of his associates, his companies, everybody. I mean, that is, Bobby, if this holds up in court, there are some legal challenges going on right now. And my hope is that this will not stand up to legal challenges. But if it does, then yeah, it's incredibly valuable to Donald Trump. I think this slush fund part of it, which got more attention, actually is something that Trump doesn't really care about that much because it doesn't financially benefit him. He wants to be able to say to his supporters, look, I tried to get you $2 billion and the court said no, or somebody said no and blocked it, but I wanted to do it for you and it didn't happen. And he doesn't really care at the end of the day because he's not profiting from it. But where he's profiting directly is from this release of claims, which can potentially, it's potentially worth billions of dollars to him. He and his sons are making money hand over fist off the presidency. And this release of claims is going to be used as a defense if we later try to recoup the money that he is stealing from the presidency. And that is, it's just incredibly valuable to him financially, as well as to his sons and his companies.
That is absolutely amazing. No accountability. Speaking of which, I want to circle back on something that you mentioned earlier, and I saw one of your well done YouTube shorts. The transfer of Ghislaine Maxwell. There's a little bit more to this too. Correct me if I'm wrong. Todd Blanche signed basically some memo that gives him the authority to move prisoners all over the country without having any check or balance, and forget the protocol and the statutes we've been using for generations. Can you go into that, please?
Yeah. So in the federal prison system, there's a really complex kind of bureaucratic way of deciding what type of prison you get sent to serve a federal sentence. And it's based on a lot of factors, primarily how secure does the facility need to be to keep the public safe. And if you're convicted of a violent crime, for example, you're much more likely to go to a higher security facility. If it's a nonviolent crime, it may be a lower security facility, but there are rigorous processes and procedures in place that determine where you go. And for example, somebody like Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted of a sex offense, is not eligible to go to a minimum security prison camp because that doesn't protect the community. Todd Blanche orchestrated this prison transfer of Maxwell, and I think he saw that it's kind of hard to pull those strings because there's so many rules and regulations, and he wanted to make it easier. So he had the director of the Bureau of Prisons, who oversees all the prison facilities, who reports directly to Blanche, sign a new policy that gives the Attorney General the authority to override all of the existing rules and regulations and put people in the federal prison system wherever he wants. That is incredibly scary for a number of different reasons. One is that it means the president or Blanche can give special treatment to people who are political allies and friends. That means people who are convicted of violent crimes could be sent to minimum security prisons if they make donations, for example, to Donald Trump, or if they invest in his crypto business or whatever it may be. And on the flip side, it means that people he doesn't like could be sent to supermax prisons to serve sentences for nonviolent crimes. For example, people like the representative in New Jersey who was charged with protesting outside of an ICE facility, or people who are actually protesting ICE in Minneapolis and other places who are being prosecuted. If those people are convicted of crimes, Donald Trump could decide, you're enemies of the state, and direct Todd Blanche to put them in supermax prisons. So the potential for abuse and corruption is incredibly scary there, and is really just unprecedented in history. The Attorney General has never had that type of authority before, for very good reason. And we just have no idea how Todd Blanche might use and abuse that particular authority that he's now given himself.
He's up for confirmation. He's got to go in front of the Senate. What do you want the Senate to ask this man? What can really put his cards on the table as far as what we expect to get? Because right now it seems like a runaway freight train.
I think that what the Senate really needs to do is just expose how many lies he has told to date. He has told so many lies, and the lies date back to his first confirmation hearing. During his confirmation hearing to become the Deputy Attorney General, Tom Tillis, who's an influential Republican senator, because he sometimes does vote against Trump's nominees, asked him, "Can you promise me that if you are confirmed, there will not be a whiff of a political investigation coming out of this administration?" And Todd Blanche looked Tom Tillis in the eye and he said, "I can commit to that." And that was obviously couldn't have been further from the truth. We have seen political investigation after political investigation, everybody from James Comey to the Southern Poverty Law Center to the members of Congress who made that video saying don't follow illegal orders in the military. I mean, all these people who Blanche has allowed to be investigated and prosecuted, in some cases unsuccessfully under his leadership, just show that he was lying to Tom Tillis when he said that in his confirmation hearing. And I hope that the Senate will not make the mistake again of taking him at face value. They should be asking him hard questions substantiated by facts to expose the lies that he has told to date.
I tell you, I think it's going to be must-see television, not because of the entertainment value, but to see literally what, again, I keep hammering this, the number one law enforcement officer of the United States of America says he's going to be about. Along those lines, right, we're seeing all of these things happen by a stroke of a pen. This executive power type mentality has gripped the federal government. Trump is trying to rule by executive order. What are your thoughts on this? Because you've talked a little bit about this in different spheres, especially when you were dealing with the pardon attorney stuff. What are we to take from this?
Well, Donald Trump likes instant gratification. So he likes things that he can make happen without having to rely on Congress. I mean, you see how frustrated he's been lately with Congress. He blew up a bipartisan bill signing because Congress wouldn't pass the SAVE Act, which is something that's important to him to mess with our voting. So he doesn't like it when he has to go through a process. He doesn't like it when he has to rely on others to get something done. He doesn't like it when he's accountable to courts. He likes things that can shortcut getting stuff done. He's been able to do a lot through executive orders. Unfortunately for him, the executive order on birthright citizenship did not hold up. And that was an example of the Supreme Court putting some limits on him. But for the most part, they've let him do what he pleases to a really stunning degree. And I think another area where he sees the potential to do that is pardons, the pardon power. There was some new reporting that came out in the Atlantic yesterday about the possibility that Trump's going to announce 250 pardons in celebration of America's 250th birthday. And that is just has a tremendous amount of potential for abuse. I mean, ordinarily, there could easily be put together a list of 250 people who deserve pardons, but not in Donald Trump's world. The 250 people on the list are going to be people who are pulling strings and leveraging connections. And the Atlantic article talked about how it's become a feeding frenzy was one of the quotes. It's basically like the Hunger Games for pardons is what Donald Trump has created, where people are doing everything in their power to claw their way to being on this list of 250 people. And we don't even know if the list will materialize. People in Trump's inner circle are saying that it hasn't yet been finalized. It hasn't yet been decided whether there even will be 250 pardons. But we can be sure that if there are, many, if not all of them, are going to be quite corrupt.
You mentioned in passing the SAVE Act, and this is something that I personally don't think is getting enough attention. I think if you are any type of minority group, but specifically if you are a woman, this should be near the forefront of your political thought. Can you briefly explain why the SAVE Act is such a diabolical piece of legislation? Because that's how I see it.
Yeah. So it would really put an incredible burden on women primarily to be able to vote. You've got to prove your citizenship. And the way to prove your citizenship is either you've got to have a passport, or you've got to have a state issued ID that matches the name on your birth certificate. About half of all Americans don't have a passport. So if you don't have a passport, then you've got to have an ID and a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate has to match the name on the ID. So if you're a woman who has gotten married and changed your name, or if you're anyone who's changed your name from your birth name for any reason, and your birth certificate still has your birth name and your current ID has a different name, then you're not going to be able to meet the requirement to be able to vote. To get a new birth certificate, to get those documents updated, I mean, that's an incredibly time-consuming process, and it is not something that can necessarily even be completed in time for the election. And if people don't know about this requirement and they just show up at the polls and they don't have the documents, they will be turned away and not able to vote if this law passes. The purpose is to disenfranchise people. It's to make it harder to exercise this constitutional right to vote, which just makes absolutely no sense. I mean, we should want it to be as easy as possible in this country to vote. I live in Washington, D.C., which we are disenfranchised in many ways here because we don't have a voting member of Congress or the Senate, but they do make it very easy to vote here. We get a mail-in ballot and we can fill it in advance, and we can drop it in a drop box in advance, or we can just show up at the polling place on the day of and you can certify that you are who you say you are. There's no requirements. If I had to go to the polling place and have my documents in order on the day of election, that would just come as a huge shock to me. It's not what I'm used to. And I know for a lot of people, it would make it impossible for them to be able to exercise their right to vote. But that seems to be exactly what Donald Trump is trying to do here.
It's amazing because the cost of doing that too, buying a passport, going to your whatever county clerk to get your birth certificate. There are people who cannot afford to buy a passport, right, especially in this age of increased cost. And so it seems between that, what the Supreme Court has ruled, all the things we're seeing, it is becoming you've got to pay to play in our democracy. Like, seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, Liz, real quick. Sorry to cut you off. My final question is there anything, because I get this question all the time, is there anything we can do, or do we just, we do the best we can and hope that our representatives do something? A lot of people feel helpless. I know you come on every day and you show us what's happening, and you do so in a great, concise manner. But it's a lot for people these days. I mean, is there any hope moving forward?
Yeah. So what I think is really important for everybody to think about is to think about just like taking it little bit by bit. We can't solve it all. No one of us can solve all of these problems or make everything better by ourselves. And it can feel so overwhelming that it's like almost paralyzing sometimes to see everything that's happening and think, what can we do? I think that we need to just think about if we can all take one small step every day to protect the things that we care about, to protect the values of our democracy, that is enough, and that will add up, and that is what's going to get us through this time. So we can't think about solving the whole problem. We just need to think about doing one thing each day that we can, that's within our power, to protect our democracy. I think that right now a really good focus is, maybe it's just because I'm focused on it, is Todd Blanche's upcoming confirmation. I have a post on my Substack where I've laid out who the senators are who might be most persuadable to vote against him. And there's a list of about 22 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. If any one of them votes against Blanche, it would block his nomination from moving forward. So you could go through that list over the next 2 weeks and just make one call or send one email per day to one of the people on that list. And that will make a difference, because we just need to persuade one of those people not to vote, one of those Republicans. To be clear, there are 12 Republicans on the committee. Only one of them has to vote against Blanche to block his nomination from going out of committee. And that's like a small thing that we could do each day that could potentially make a really big difference. So I would encourage people to focus on those small, achievable things. And if we all do them, eventually we will succeed in protecting the things we care about, and we will get through this terrible moment in our country's history.
Ladies and gentlemen, you asked what you can do. Liz Oyer has just told you. Liz, I cannot thank you enough for your service to our country, your continued service to our country. Just because you're not in that office anymore, I've learned more about high-level federal law function watching your YouTube shorts than I have in years of just watching C-SPAN. So I appreciate it so very, very much. Please tell everyone where they can find you and your Substack.
Yeah, I'm Lawyer Oyer on Substack as well as Instagram and TikTok. And I've got all the materials I promised about Todd Blanche and how you can contact your senators on the Substack. And thanks so much for having me on, Bobby. I always enjoy talking to you.
No, I really enjoy it, man. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Liz Oyer, educating all of us. Again, our continued dedication to subject matter expertise. They don't get any more expertise than Liz Oyer, especially dealing with the Attorney General's office. Thanks for joining us, Liz.
Thanks, Bobby.